Forget the skirmishes you saw last week. Forget the predictable, routine shelling. What descended upon Odessa in the dead of night was not war. It was an extinction-level event for civilian infrastructure. 450 confirmed, Russian-launched attack drones. 450 flying instruments of war, synchronized to overload every defensive layer, aimed directly at the lifeblood of a city of 1 million people. This was not about seizing territory. This was about absolute, total infrastructural destruction. This extraordinary and dangerous assault achieved its goal. The lights are out, the water pressure is zero, and the communications grid is effectively severed. This blitz, this unprecedented air armada, has left 1 million people instantly stranded in darkness, cold, and silence. We are staring at a strategic vulnerability engineered by the Kremlin, and the scope of this devastation is sending shockwaves not just through Kiev, but through Washington and Brussels. We need to decode the target matrix of this 450 drone swarm. This wasn't indiscriminate bombing for psychological effect alone. Analysts are confirming that the vast majority were targeted with surgical precision at high-value assets. The main transmission nodes, the primary switching stations, and what Russia clearly believes is key command and control infrastructure. The goal was to inflict meaningful operational damage that prevents any organized military or humanitarian recovery for weeks, potentially months. This is the raw force of political will applied directly to civilian life support. This is the closest we've come to a fundamental, unblinking confrontation since the initial invasion phase. The unspoken rules, the diplomatic guardrails, they have vanished in the smoke rising over Odessa. This level of premeditated, strategic destruction marks a sudden, horrifying pivot in this conflict. It is a geopolitical page turning in real time. And the response? Kiev has fired back, not just with defensive missiles, but with an unusually blunt threat echoing across every capital. They are furious. The Ukrainian foreign minister's statement was crafted, tested, and weighed before delivery. It made it unmistakably clear. This catastrophic energy blackout must trigger a corresponding, resolute response from the collective West. For months, we have talked about Russia's red line, what NATO cannot do. Today, Odessa shows us the opposite. A newly drawn, dark red line defining what Russia absolutely will do to cripple Ukraine beyond repair. The West's failure to act decisively now will harden into posture, establishing a terrifying new normal where mass civilian infrastructure collapse is an accepted weapon of war. This moment leans dangerously toward escalation. If Russia perceives zero proportional response to the deliberate dismantling of a million-person city's life support systems, the next step will be predictable, applying the same template to Mykolaiv, to Kharkiv, and eventually pushing toward Kiev itself. We have confirmation that emergency consultations are underway across NATO. The question is no longer if they should respond, but how dramatically they must change their calculus. The demand from Ukraine is simple. If we cannot protect our sky, you must help us hit the source. This shifts the focus immediately to expanded retaliation options against the launch sites deep within occupied or Russian territory. The calculus has changed. Leaders must decide now if they will be intimidated by Russia's nuclear rhetoric, or if they will provide the appropriate response necessary to re-establish deterrence. Odessa is the siren call of a new, unrestricted war. A call that demands a dramatic shift in policy, or we risk losing the fight for Ukraine's survival in the darkness. The 450 drone swarm wasn't just terror, it was a test of the world's resolve. We are now waiting to see if the West flinches. This was not a random act of violence targeting civilian morale alone. This was an extraordinary and dangerous operational choice. The Odesa Blackout was a symphony of destructive efficiency, built on highly specific intelligence and executed with terrifying precision. We are dissecting the anatomy of the strike now, and what we find is terrifying. Russia did not engage in scattershot bombing. They employed the raw force of political will, systematically targeting Ukraine's power grid backbone. The critical substations, the key transmission hubs, the high-value switching centers, all essential nodes of command and control infrastructure. The scale itself was the weapon. A blitz of 450 unmanned aerial vehicles, mostly Shaheds, designed not just to hit targets, but to overwhelm every existing layer of air defense redundancy. These drones were specifically crafted to cause meaningful operational damage. They attacked in waves, calibrated and timed to ensure that as one substation was knocked offline, Its backup transfer station was simultaneously destroyed, preventing the grid operators from isolating the damage and routing power around the breach. This isn't terror bombing as we understood it during the Cold War. This is weaponizing silence, engineering total, systemic failure to break Ukraine's economic capacity and military sustainment. The result is total darkness, and the political shock waves are echoing across every capital in the West. Because this act changes everything. We are watching the page turning in real time. The conventional boundaries Russia pretended to adhere to have dissolved. When Kyiv looks at Odessa now, they see the closest we've come to a strategic red line being not just crossed, but obliterated in a flash of transformer fire. And Ukraine fired back. Not necessarily with missiles yet, but with diplomacy so sharp it became an arrow. Kyiv's official response was an unusually blunt threat directed squarely at Moscow. That threat, delivered within hours, was unmistakably clear. Russia has escalated into unrestricted infrastructure war, and the Ukrainian government will not be intimidated. They are now actively considering expanded retaliation options against Russian infrastructure deemed critical to sustaining Moscow's war effort. This is the hinge moment. This is the moment the situation leans dangerously toward escalation, moving rapidly away from controlled conflict. Russia tested and weighed this extreme action. They calculated what the West would permit. They calculated that diplomatic outrage was cheap and that air defense supplies would be slow. They calculated that they could cause catastrophic damage while facing only rhetorical resistance. It is now incumbent upon NATO and the G7 to prove that calculation fundamentally wrong. Western rhetoric must immediately harden into posture. The time for deliberation is over. We need a resolute response that shows Russia that this strategy will fail, not because Ukraine is resilient, but because the West has made a definitive decision that the lights must stay on. The U.S. administration needs to be furious, communicating privately and publicly that this aggression demands immediate, non-negotiable consequences. An appropriate response means the immediate delivery of air defense systems capable of intercepting swarms of this size. Hundreds of drones simultaneously. Not next quarter, but next week. The longer the West hesitates, the more this new, unrestricted warfare, built on engineered systemic blackouts, will be cemented as the global standard. The playbook has been set, tested, and executed. If we allow Russia to succeed in using mass blackout as a weapon of conquest, we risk validating this strategy globally. The darkness in Odessa is a political vulnerability that must be addressed with decisive military speed. The human reality of that darkness is now the singular driving engine for confrontation. We are talking about a crisis of 1 million people fighting for literal physical survival inside the Black Zone. The 450-drone Blitz was not aimed solely at electrical grids. It was aimed at infrastructure supporting life itself. Right now, in Odessa, the fight is not for territory. The fight is for the continued functioning of hospitals, reliant on dwindling diesel stores. The fight is for water purification plants, which have ceased working entirely, transforming a city into a potential biohazard zone. Survival diaries are emerging from the blackout zones, detailing neighbors pooling resources to keep dialysis machines running, detailing the terror when the last communication signal drops and parents realize their children are truly, utterly isolated in a collapsed urban landscape. This horrific reality has sent shockwaves through every NATO capital. What happened in Odessa is viewed as an extraordinary and dangerous escalation, a move far beyond previous attacks, signaling a terrifying shift in Russia's strategic goals. The diplomatic facade has collapsed. The response from Western powers has been swift, furious, and fired back across the airwaves with a speed we haven't witnessed in years. The message is unmistakable. This isn't just strong rhetoric. This is the closest we've come to a direct, unblinking confrontation since the start of the conflict. The raw force of political will is now driving policies that were previously confined to contingency planning documents. The page is turning in real time. We are watching diplomatic nuance harden into posture, and that posture leans dangerously toward escalation. In response to the targeting of civilian life support, the White House and key EU security councils are executing an unusually blunt threat, a threat that is now echoing across every capital. Any further mass targeting of essential civilian infrastructure designed to render a major city uninhabitable will be treated as crossing an irreversible red line. What does crossing that red line mean? It means expanded retaliation options. We understand that targeted military planners are defining clear, high-value targets within Russian command and control infrastructure. These are not symbolic targets. These are facilities identified to inflict meaningful operational damage. The calculus has fundamentally changed. If Moscow seeks to wage war by plunging millions into medieval conditions, they will receive a resolute response designed to cripple their ability to conduct these operations. Every option has been crafted, tested, and weighed. The political decision-makers have made it clear that they will not be intimidated by this weaponization of darkness. This isn't just about restoring power. This is about redefining the acceptable boundaries of modern warfare. And Russia has pushed the boundary so far that it demands an appropriate response that reestablishes deterrence through punitive measures. The world is watching to see how this newly adopted, highly aggressive posture translates into military action. Odessa's darkness has illuminated the path toward a wider conflict, and policymakers are ready to step down that path. This Odessa attack, this total intentional blinding of the critical Black Sea port, is not just a military action. It is an extraordinary and dangerous act of statecraft designed to rip the conflict out of the slow, grinding warfare we thought we understood. The strategic value of Odessa is manifold. It is the primary economic lung for Ukraine and a choke point for global grain stability. By hitting it with a record-shattering 450 drones, Moscow wasn't just attempting to destabilize the power grid. It was sending a message echoing across every capital. That economic warfare is now kinetic, comprehensive, and unbounded. Why Odessa now? Because Putin needed to showcase the raw force of political will, a demonstration of unchecked capacity to inflict meaningful operational damage on high-value civilian and command and control infrastructure. The sheer volume of the drone swarm, far surpassing previous waves, was a stress test, a deliberate attempt to overwhelm and exhaust Ukrainian air defenses, leaving the region totally vulnerable. This action was a calculated move toward what we are calling port silence, the enforced incapacitation of Ukraine's maritime access, forcing a total economic shutdown. The response from Kyiv and its allies has been immediate and furious. Within hours, Ukraine fired back, hitting infrastructure deep within Russian territory. A rapid escalation that is fundamentally changing the rules of engagement. When we track the sudden jump in rhetoric, it is unmistakably clear that diplomatic guardrails are gone. We are now witnessing the closest we've come to direct, unblinking confrontation between major powers since the Cold War. This is the page turning in real time. The geopolitical temperature has spiked so high that the language coming from NATO headquarters no longer features ambiguity. It has started to harden into posture. European leaders, stunned by the scale of the destruction, the targeted erasure of power for 1 million civilians, have acknowledged that Moscow has crossed a red line. They see this massive infrastructure blitz not as a defensive reaction, but as an aggressive, offensive attempt to break the national will of an entire population. This intentional targeting of the civilian core, the deliberate use of the blackout as a weapon, leans dangerously toward escalation. The subsequent threats emerging from both sides are unusually blunt. Moscow has issued warnings concerning any further deep strike retaliation, stating that such actions will invite a response of unprecedented force. Kyiv and its partners, though, have refused to be intimidated. They understand that acquiescing to this terror campaign grants Putin a strategic victory he cannot be allowed to claim. Therefore, the discussions happening behind closed doors right now are not about de-escalation. They are about calibrating the severity of the resolute response. Military strategists are urgently crafting, testing, and weighing new expanded retaliation options. They are determining the appropriate response, a move severe enough to re-establish deterrence without tripping the final catastrophic wire. Every single parameter of the conflict is being reassessed. The reality is harsh. The gloves are off. The international community, which spent 2 years trying to define an acceptable perimeter around this conflict, now watches as Russia purposefully obliterates that perimeter with hundreds of attack drones. The shock waves from Odessa's darkness are reverberating across global energy markets, security pacts, and diplomatic tables. This sudden shift toward total war is unmistakably clear. The era of measured responses is over. We are now staring down the barrel of a conflict governed purely by the raw force of political will, a dangerous game where both sides are seeking to define the limits of the other through increasingly violent, increasingly destructive displays of power. The world is changing beneath our feet, and Odesa's blackout is the flashing warning light that signifies we are heading into uncharted, perilous waters. We talk about drones and infrastructure targets, but we must focus on the front line where this conflict is fought. The grid itself. This is not just metal and wires. This is the life support of a nation and the human shields protecting it. The assault on Odesa was extraordinary and dangerous. It wasn't just destructive. It was aimed at total systemic collapse. The sheer scale of the 450-drone Blitz signifies a deliberate attempt to erase the infrastructure necessary for modern life, and more importantly, to halt the superhuman efforts of Ukraine's energy engineers. These workers, who crawl through the wreckage while shrapnel is still flying, are the true unsung heroes of this war. They are fighting the desperate race to reconstruct under fire. They are the human bulwark against utter darkness. Yet their sacrifice is now translating directly into geopolitical shock waves felt across the globe. Kiev, we are told, fired back. Not just defensively, but with strategic depth. We are seeing meaningful operational damage being inflicted far beyond the immediate lines of contact. Reports, still unconfirmed but undeniably credible, suggest high-value Russian targets, specifically command and control infrastructure, have been crippled in immediate response. The message being sent, echoing across every capital from Washington to Beijing, is now unmistakably clear. The rules of engagement are dissolved. This escalating exchange brings us the closest we've come, not just this year, but since the invasion began, to the uncontrolled spillover NATO analysts have nightmares about. We are watching the raw force of political will being tested in the unforgiving laboratory of the battlefield. The diplomatic page is turning in real time, and the ink is staining the global order. What was once policy is now beginning to harden into posture. This entire situation leans dangerously toward escalation. Moscow is furious. Their measured responses have evaporated, replaced by an unusually blunt threat delivered not through diplomatic channels, but screamed into the media void. They are defining what they believe is a new red line. But this red line is not being respected. It is being dissected, studied, and frankly ignored by Kiev and its supporters. For months, Washington and Brussels have crafted, tested, and weighed their response frameworks. They have stressed that they will not be intimidated. This latest aggression in Odesa demands a resolute response. The U.S. Secretary of State's carefully worded condemnation was an immediate precursor to the announcement of expanded retaliation options being considered, designed to deliver the appropriate response to the systematic obliteration of civilian infrastructure. This isn't just about supplying defensive aid anymore. This is about establishing a deterrence posture that is undeniable and immediately punitive. The stakes are defined by the heroism of the reconstruction workers. Their willingness to die fixing a blown transformer is the moral and strategic underpinning for the West's immediate and forceful reaction. Think about those energy workers. They are the thin blue line against total collapse. They understand that every repaired transmission tower is an act of defiance, not just maintenance. Russia's strategy is simple. Attack the repair crews. Attack the repair logistics. Attack the rebuilt station the minute it comes back online. This turns every act of reconstruction into an act of direct military confrontation. And every time those lights come back on in Odesa, the diplomatic temperature rises. It signifies that Russia's terror campaign has failed to break the will of the Ukrainian people, forcing the Kremlin to choose between admitting defeat in this war of attrition or ramping up the destruction to an intolerable, globally destabilizing degree. This is the choice we face tonight. The lights are out in Odesa, but the fire is spreading globally. We are heading toward the precipice, pushed by the unrelenting pressure of those 450 drones. The world is watching Ukraine's grid operators become the unexpected, central figures in a confrontation that threatens to redefine international conflict forever. Their sacrifice is the world's warning. And that warning, ladies and gentlemen, is issuing forth in an extraordinary and dangerous cascade of events. The Odesa Blackout is not simply a power outage. It is the physical manifestation of a geopolitical shift. The world watches, frozen, as Russia executes what can only be termed energy genocide, the calculated elimination of a nation's life support system during the dead of winter. This is the closest we've come to a fundamental, uncontrolled rupture in the European security architecture since the Cold War. The scale of the 450-drone Blitz has acted as a catalyst, tearing away the pretense of limited conflict. The response has been immediate, and in diplomatic terms, chillingly aggressive. Kyiv has already fired back, not just rhetorically, but with strategic depth, making it unmistakably clear that this aggression demands reciprocity. And that message is echoing across every capital of the NATO alliance. We are witnessing the raw force of political while suddenly being focused on the undeniable fact that Moscow views civilian infrastructure not as collateral damage, but as the primary strategic objective. The page turning in real time is accelerating into a whirlwind. Behind the closed doors in Brussels and Washington, patience has evaporated. Sources confirm that the mood among defense ministers is furious, transitioning quickly from indignation to the cold calculation of reprisal. This is where rhetoric begins to harden into posture. Leaders are drafting responses that, just weeks ago, would have been considered unthinkable. We are hearing the language of an unusually blunt threat now being openly articulated. Russia has deliberately crossed a fundamental red line: the systematic attempt to extinguish life through infrastructure collapse. The shock waves from Odesa are already reaching the power grids of Central Europe. The stability of interconnected European infrastructure is now deemed a high-value target by the Kremlin, testing the collective resolve of the continent. If Russia can blind and freeze a city of 1 million people with impunity, what stops them from targeting cross-border energy pipelines or crucial communication hubs deeper within NATO territory? Nothing. This realization leans dangerously toward escalation. Defense strategists are no longer discussing mere sanctions. They are modeling strikes designed to inflict meaningful operational damage on Russia's high-value command and control infrastructure. The goal is not just to defend Ukraine, but to directly disable the mechanisms of Russian aggression itself. Every single option for expanded retaliation options is now on the table. These moves are not being rushed. They are being painstakingly crafted, tested, and weighed against the risk of wider war. But the consensus is absolute. We cannot be intimidated by Putin's deliberate engineering of catastrophe. The sheer audacity of the 450-drone attack necessitates a response that is asymmetrical, immediate, and utterly devastating to the architects of this energy genocide. The era of strategic ambiguity is over. An appropriate response must now extend beyond supplying defensive material. It must involve direct counterpunching that raises the cost of this infrastructure terror campaign to an unbearable level for the Kremlin elite. This demands a resolute response, a posture of unblinking confrontation. The world must recognize that Russia's war is no longer a localized tragedy. It is a direct assault on the fundamental stability of European life, and we are moments away from a confrontation where the lights go out across an entire continent, not just in Odessa. The clock is ticking down, and this confrontation will be defined by who blinks first. And right now, the entire free world cannot afford to even twitch.